Someone confirm if the timer is working.
Yeah, it's visible and working.
That's working, visible.
Great, so we are good to go.
Cool. Assuming that I'm still audible clearly, if at any point there are any issues with my internet, let me know. 1, 2. I will try my best to take 2 POIs in my speech. Just don't unmute. I will ensure that I try to ask them. In the worst case scenario, I'll still be taking one, but yeah. I will start the speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Governments are thus far the most resourceful actors given the infrastructure, access to technology, control mechanisms such as military and disaster management support, and are also bound by the simple contract for life as the state to its citizens to protect them in scenarios where they individually or collectively have zero capabilities to protect themselves, but more importantly, are not responsible for the calamities. There will be 2 levels of argumentation in my speech. 1, principal argumentation on legitimacy and duty, and second, argumentation on government responsibility and its impact on the smallest actors and the vision of government in the future. Firstly, legitimacy and duty. Panel, we believe this is largely a legitimate move for 2 reasons. 1, that government has resource control on the highest amount of resource control on a comparative, which means they're in a prime position to avoid all kinds of disruption. This is true because of 3 large reasons. 1, because of the safety mechanisms of things such as tech, that is an ability to predict what's about to happen, things such as military, that is to avoid that things in terms of disaster management that will happen after they've happened in terms of protection and moving people out of an area. And secondly, in terms of the resources that you hold and the responsibility that you have. Thirdly, in terms of why individuals move to certain places, because the government forces them to, that is, the government tells you to go farm at a certain place, the government tells you to settle at a certain place to create livelihood and development there, and the government ensures that infrastructural development happens so that it can contribute to the GDP for the government. We feel based on these promises of safety that your businesses and livelihood would be good, you often move, and citizens' lives are thus controlled by, in all aspects, by the government. We feel they have a legitimate responsibility to those lives at that point. 2, governments are implicitly responsible often in terms of how these disasters pan out. That is an ops best case scenario where they say, oh, listen, even if you knew something is about to happen, there was nothing you could have done. False. Panel, 2 levels of argumentation. 1, in terms of notice how the reason that most amount of people die in terms of floods or earthquakes is because of bad town planning by the government. That is to say, ensuring bad implementation of housing technology in terms of creating non-earthquake like resistant buildings, or allowing industries to breach like fault lines for earthquakes or flood paths, and ensuring development in every area possible, which means the government always has a capability to gauge the possible damage in the future that might fall. We feel this proves the legitimacy of this move. Lastly, on duty, panel, we believe there's an explicit duty of the government to protect its citizens. This is true for 3 reasons. 1, because these individuals vote for the government to protect and create like infrastructural development, but also to ensure that there's governance of the top order by this government. 2, there's an implicit trust that you place in the government the day you vote for them, or in the day that you buy into their regime, because you weren't born with your own consent, which means at all points of time you believe and trust the government to take the best decisions for you. 3rd, because even in the scenarios where you do not trust the government, you have no ability to act and protect yourself just because you have a lack of resources, information, and lack of epistemic access to ever fucking know that you will be like in the middle of a flood because you're an individual without the resources the government holds. On that, do I have a POI from opening opposition?
Please explain why treating this specifically as a crime against humanity is something that fixes any of what you just said.
Yeah, I will prove that in terms of the future of vision. Second argumentation in terms of government responsibility and why government is forcefully responsible and how things change in the future. Panel, given how climate change is happening, there needs to be international alignment for the protection of life, because for the longest amount of time, the lives that have been lost because of climate change directly have been invisibilized because of a lack of incentive on governments and a lack of responsibility by them, which means that this responsibility is just an extension of the government duty that the government serves in general. Now you're just taking cognizance of a new situation which you have avoided for the longest amount of time. In status quo, thirdly, the way that responsibility like is pushed by government is post facto, that is after the disaster has happened and after the damage has been put on citizens. You call it an act of God and ensure that you get away with it. That is to say, in our world, it's no longer considered an act of God. We feel that things such as increased development in general or all government activities are a direct response, like a direct act due to which all kinds of flooding and things like that happen. That is to say, in Ob's best case scenario, if they were to say that these things are unprecedented and happened and the government had no control, that argument would have only been true, say 100, 200 years ago. We feel today all kinds of calamities happen because of government actions. It's true for 6 reasons. One, in terms of industrialization increase, which benefits sectors and GDP for the government directly. Two, in terms of deforestation to increase wood production to supply industries and coal industries in general. Three, in terms of increasing mining to increase government revenue, which comes from natural resources and increase FDI for international companies to come and exploit them. D, in terms of farming accordance to government needs as to what production of what grains is needed in what regions and how people need to use more drugs on their plants to increase production for an ever increasing population the government does not take responsibility for. E, in terms of lack of CO2 regulations, because cars, industries end up producing massive amounts of CO2, which increases a lot of rains and floods, and it ends up increasing the chances of rivers being flooded at all points of times. And lastly, in terms of natural ecological destruction, because there's a lack of incentive on the governments to care for it, because it's not seen as an economically viable option. The governments thus need to be more responsible, because in status quo, there's a lack of effort, there's a lack of international compliance. Sure, you've signed the Paris Agreement, but the way that you come about it is extremely so. Things such as droughts and wildfires are often done because of the irresponsibility of the shit the government pulls off in terms of 14 million square meters of forest being destroyed by the government in terms of just wildfires they started. Before I move forward, I'll take a POI from closing.
So how would you characterize an entire society that has suddenly been devastated by a big flood in which they lost their homes? Do you think they're happy with the government?
No, I think they're extremely unhappy with the government. They just don't have options because the next government also doesn't have an incentive until and unless this policy is implemented, which means in status quo that as soon as this policy is implemented, your reactions to ensure that you're opposite to the incentives of corporates increase. That is to say, in status quo, corporates have an incentive to act against any kind of environmentally friendly policy. With this motion, higher incentive to work against cooperation by the government is increased. Notice panel, this debate is just about the fact that there is a duty which the government does not fulfill. How can we increase the incentives to ensure that they protect individuals from climate change? Two levels of impacting. One, in terms of in status quo, how there's no identification of victims, how things such as famine in Bengal, not building hospitals during pandemics, not protecting citizens in war are general things, but the same amount of individuals who die because of climate change and because of you not taking responsibility are always invisibilized because you just do not fathom how things will pan out. In terms of second, current systems being bad because there's a lack of vision by the government to imagine that, oh, flooding will ensure that all of my railway systems will not work. And if someone tells you that today, your party leaders are more likely to laugh it off. But at a point of time when you implement this policy, you're more likely to see change because now they see the vision of the long-term impacts and the responsibility that they have to now push forward by going to the international court. We're very, very proud to take this debate.
I thank the PM for that speech. I call upon the yellow to start the case of side opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Sorry, if you said anything, I couldn't hear you. Am I audible?
Perfectly audible.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what side government is proposing is like saying I should shoot a kid and then punish their parents for not providing the child with a bulletproof vest. Yes, the parents were responsible, but was it really their fault? I think what this debate has to be about is two things. Firstly, does this crime meet the standard of crime against humanity on principle? And secondly, on impact. Note, this debate is not about is climate change bad, because if that's a debate, then OG and O both agree. Let's talk about the problem with side government first in this debate, and then I'll frame specific rebuttals. The problem with them is quite simple, right? They explain why the state is more responsible than people, but don't explain why an individual state is responsible. Bangladesh didn't pollute the sky, yet it faces 6 tornadoes per year because of actions that happen in America, because of America's bad mining policies. In places like Philippines, Sri Lanka, and India, we have tsunamis, we have earthquakes because of actions of other countries, and punishing our governments for the impact of that is ridiculous and unfair, let alone something that we should be standing for. Firstly, on governments and their intentions, and secondly, why you solve nothing. OG's case is that governments are bad. I'm going to prove to you why governments already don't want to be bad. 5 reasons. 1, countries currently want people to not die because those people vote for them, and if people die, they lose power in democracies. Secondly, even if it's not about just voting, people working for governments, people research labs, etc., people working in climate parts of those governments are individuals who necessarily care about other individuals, because at the end they are also humans, which means they're going to do their best to ensure that people don't die, right? Thirdly, even if it's a dictatorial regime, and this is a small minority of the cases, these individuals care about stability of their country and the economic benefits or prevention of economic loss from climate change, and so on and so forth. Fifthly, third-party organizations and private companies like Google Climate Race work very hard as well. We have more private satellites and scientists working on like general climate research and telling people and trying to predict tornadoes, etc., so on and so forth, so as to get the information out, which means in all cases where a state has failed to help its people, it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they're corrupt, it's simply because they lack the resources, it's simply because they couldn't predict what was going to happen, right? An example of this problem is caused by permafrost unfreezing, which is to say we can generally predict rising like sea temperature levels and predict tornadoes and because of pressure difference, but because the permafrost is unfreezing, sometimes there are suddenly a low temperature zone and a high temperature zone which leads to tornadoes which we just cannot predict and no one can be helped. How does this engage with OG's claim? OG's claim is that governments cannot see the future and they make bad decisions now. Except if that is the case, then the harms are symmetric. Which is to say, if you can't see the future, or if governments can't see the impacts of climate change, which I talked about, they probably also can't see the deterrence that is provided by the policy on side governments world, which means on both sides deterrence doesn't work. But lastly, on post facto, they said that the next political party that comes, that will also do the same thing, so no change happens. Except this is a lie, right? Because if I see my house getting burned on by climate change, the first thing I'll ask the next politician is, how are you working to solve this one problem, right? It becomes a voting issue. It becomes something that people demand of a politicians to fix, and therefore there's already enough deterrence. You don't need to do what OG says. What is the harm of OG's case then? Twofold. One, you harm people who lack resources and unfairly punish them, and secondly, you cause double jeopardy to those countries. How do you harm people who didn't aim to do so? Note that crimes have actus rea and mens rea. I already proved to you that there is zero mens rea for these countries, right? The Bangladeshi government doesn't want the people of their country to like get their homes destroyed in tornadoes. What that means is, even if you believe it's negligence, even if you believe it's a bad government, right, it still doesn't meet the standard of crimes against humanity, right? Because those are terrorists, those are evil people who torture other individuals, those are people making choices to make the world a much worse place. Which means even if you buy everything on OG so far, you still don't treat it as a crime against humanity. You could probably just like give them a slap on the wrist. The second reason is double jeopardy, because no government bench in this debate assumes that the government is a separate homogeneous entity, an entity separate from the people. But that is categorically untrue. When you punish governments, you're essentially punishing an aggregate of collective human preferences, because people vote their governments in power. What that means is these people already lost their home, and now the people who they elected or who they believe could have helped them are now being jailed, are being imprisoned, are being hanged to death, because it's an ICC proceeding after all, right? We think that this is unfair because you're punishing people twice for a problem which the West themselves created. And that's my last point. We think that the countries that created these problems are the one who are going to hold this trial, and that's going to like just move the burden away from the West and polluting developed countries to underdeveloped countries like Bangladesh, India, Philippines, and so on. But before that, I'll take a POI from OG. Yeah.
Hear yourself speak. Are you saying that governments can go and destroy people, but just because like the people voted them, they should not be held accountable? The same argument that is justified for like war harms and shit like that, because like the government can kill people, but listen, they voted for them, so there should be no double jeopardy. Come on, man.
No. Here's the thing. I'm saying you do not punish individuals for crimes that do not have control over. OG says that, look, people suffered because of the government, so we should make the government suffer. I'm saying when you punish the government, it's the people who suffer. Just two more impacts of this, right? For example, if I'm a Bangladeshi and my government is on trial, no company will want to invest in my country because it's going to be seen as unstable. I will have no one making policies to help my country because they're constantly living in fear of a future of the ICC trial, which is uncertainty, right? Which means it's the people that lose jobs, it's the people that lose funding, and not some magical government. Not sure like what kind of storm and PR that was. Lastly, in terms of large countries and their actions, right? Bangladesh faces tsunami because of developing countries getting industrialized. CFCs are in the air because privileged people use refrigerators and air condition. Lead is in the air because a man named Thomas Mitchell didn't like the engine knocking sounds in his in his IndyCar, and that's what poisons individuals, right? Which means the comparative isn't whether we should look at it as an act of God versus an act of our government, like OG wants to say. It's whether we should look at it as an act of this one individual poor country versus an act of a global action, right? We think the problem inside government's world is when you can hold these individual countries accountable, and when the ICC comes out and says, yes, Bangladesh was at fault, you necessarily take the blame away from global action, or rather global inaction, and you don't look for long-term solutions, because the solution is, oh, we'll just keep punishing these individual governments. What is the harm of this? One, we can't find any realistic solution to climate change, because realistic solutions to climate change aren't localized. That is absurd. Realistic solutions to climate change are always going to be global, where we recognize that every tsunami, every person dying because of climate change is an action of like a general collective and actions of human beings in especially privileged countries. The reason this is unique to opening opposition is because there's something called empathy and guilt, right? Insofar as we are make people feel guilty, make them realize that it's not Bangladesh's government that caused Bangladeshi people to die, but your actions in America that did so, and you can't feel better about yourself because like someone else got punished. It means you have to empathize with this cause. You have to like take that blame and you have to work to solve it. This is especially true in terms of like politicians and governments. A second we will expand a little bit more on this, but I think it should be clear already. That's my time. Thanks for listening.
I thank the elder for the speech. I call upon the DPR to extend the case to side opening government. Here.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Right. Let's start. One, I think on opening opposition, we've seen that they say that, look, since government cannot directly predict the outcome of a specific event, therefore they're not supposed to be liable. But it misses out on the nuance that Jibran brings, that there are multiple reasons and there is an analytical rigor as to why do we think that there's a principal responsibility that government has. It's not just to do with actively causing climate change, probably that's one of those components, but it's actively also to do with failing to protect from the impacts of climate change or the actions that has killed people for a very long period of time. We think that insofar as these examples or argumentations are true, that there are certain ideas or certain situations wherein governments can't realistically predict the impacts of climate change, and therefore it's unreasonable for them to protect them. We think that this debate is set up in a world wherein they could have taken responsibility and they could have done something about it, and they failed to do it, which means that there were resources to a certain degree in order to avert the kind or the extent of crisis that we see in the status quo. But secondly, notice how opposition's arguments are largely evasive. Opposition arguments are based upon like examples which are cherry picked. We think there are a vast amount of micro ecosystems which are also destroyed by the governments, which actively causes harm to specific places. Things such as extensive deforestation in places of Arunachal Pradesh has actively led to droughts within smaller villages and within localities. Things such as actively killing out people by creating deep amounts of mine has caused like breathing problems to people who are in nearby cities. We think that there are not just like talking about on a macro level economic disasters, but also micro level ecosystem disasters, which means that there are vast amount of things that governments has done inside their own countries, which has caused a lot of people to die, but could have been prevented. But three, notice that opposition's best argument is this. Notice you can't predict it, therefore you shouldn't apply this law. This is like saying that just because you might kill a person by accident, you shouldn't keep murder as, let's say, as a charge for punishable offense, because law in and of itself finds exceptions for things that couldn't have been seen and couldn't have been predicted, which means that it's fine for you to kill people by accident, but it's not fine for you to kill them on intent. We think that we need to punish them for instances wherein they are killed on intent or when they are killed because of irresponsibility. And this is what Jibran's vast amount of speech has been about, when he goes ahead and argues that in vast amount of instances, people have been irresponsible because there is a lack of precedence as to how climate change impact looks like. And therefore, they always think that the outcome, things such as like a station flooding up in China, is unrealistic until it happens. So therefore, they were always lazy about not taking action. On our side of the house, they become proactive on taking action because there are consequences. But there are three more reasons. One, we think that there are a vast amount of individuals within these systems who are active climate impact deniers, which means that they don't believe that there will be active and realistic impacts on their end for being actively, let's say, negligent and causing damage to the people on ground. But three, notice these are people who are always believe that there might be too much disruption in case they want to go ahead and impose these kinds of restrictions. This looks like lockdown not being imposed because you always believe that there are disruptions which might be caused to the national economy just if you want to move people from one space to another. But four, like there is an active cost and therefore the action is deprioritized to a later date. Things such as not building up like high level sea walls because you think that disaster might not be that big, or you can build it to a later date, which has caused a huge amount of people to die. We think that in vast amount of instances, government becomes actively responsible for not mitigating the extent of harm that has been caused to people, or not mitigating the cause of the harm that has caused people their deaths. We think that opposition's best analysis then is, oh, this is not evil enough because you're not a terrorist. I think that's weird, because if you're causing, or if you're abandoning your 10,000 people in your fucking city to die and die of like drowning, that's fucking evil. And you don't like necessarily need a standard of wanting to be a criminal or you wanting to be a terrorist in order to be a crime of humanity. But lastly, I think the vast amount of opposition's analysis says that, oh, you need global empathy. We think that global empathy exists on both sides of the house because it's a continuous action of international organizations that exist on both sides of the house. On opposition, there is no increase in empathy or no increase in visibility of the victims of climate change. On our side, we do, and we increase the responsibilities of the governments who are supposed to be doing these things. But thirdly, notice that in a lot of instances, let's say like things such as climate action changes are going to only decrease on opposition, given how smaller countries have always like evaded the responsibilities within the larger picture, given how US and China have always been going head to head without necessarily making sure that Bangladesh acts within its own sphere far more responsibly than it acts outwards. We think that at least on our side of the house, even though we're not able to successfully like make sure that who is the exact victim of the situation on an international stage or the perpetrator of a problem on an international stage, but at least every country on its own individual parameters will be held responsible for the damages that it has caused internally, which means that on opposition's best case, we do not get any kind of changes, but at least on our, we do. Then why do we think it's needed? Three layers here. Firstly, I think its government holding responsible in and of itself is something which is extremely important, given how in the status quo, government actively detaches itself by calling it an act of God. Three layers then. One, we think that optics get better on our side of the house because a popular leader being dragged out and being pulled out to the court actively brings a lot of eyeballs in and of itself. Notice that all of these cases are extremely like, let's say, limited in nature, which means that there are very few instances wherein you're actively getting tried by ICC. Opposition's analysis of saying that, oh, that at a point in time you get tried by ICC, you're now going to have an unstable internal government is untrue, given how rare these instances are going to be in the future, how ICC trials are extremely rare because it takes huge amount of evidence in order to drag somebody to the court. But two, that the process is long enough and there is a possibility of re-election for another individual taking place through a national mandated and regulated processes. But three, notice that in all instances when there is a media coverage for crimes against humanity being categorized under like a climate action that has to be up, like highlighted, we think we are able to far more able to get attention to climate change and its impact upon the people, which does not happen in the status quo. But to notice how it sets precedents for international deterrence, which causes smaller countries to be far more cognizant of their actions in order to make sure that these are individuals who are actively trying to do the best possible to their extent in order to make sure that they are preventing the harms of the disaster which is already going to be caused. But three, they are now going to be responsible, which means that these leaders will now have to come to stage, come to media, come to news in order to tell people why they didn't do enough in order to prevent the lives or the loss of lives which has happened, which means that there will be forced inherently to actively go out and do policy changes which are necessary to prevent these things in the future so as to make sure that their legacy isn't tarnished. But two, notice that even if ICC persecution does not succeed, the process of investigation inherently outlines the fault lines within the functioning of the government, exposes the patterns and the practices with the government, which has caused the government to become so fucking irresponsible and cause the death of so many people. We think that media exposure will always be high on our side of the house because it's not about 10 people dying, but it's about entire fucking village being wiped out or 10,000s of people being hurt by this. Or lastly, if there is direct conviction, we think that the deterrence for future leaders is going to be there because of the precedence which is created. Knowing that there is a possibility of you being ousted out of office is possibly the biggest threat that a political individual can have, which means that at least on all three fronts, no matter what happens, any ICC proceeding or any ICC involvement gets us like marginal benefit on opposition's best case and gets us like definite change on our best case. Opposition has to prove far more than why it's like not just directly visible to government, but has to prove direct harms of this action proud to propose.
I think the DPM for their speech, I call upon the dialogue to extend the case aside opening opposition here.
Am I audible?
Perfectly audible.
Right. I'm gonna begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel noticed that OG does no engagement on Nitin's idea of global issues and where accountability lies, except giving you two flimsy examples in their DPM. They tell you like about Arunachal Pradesh and so on and so forth, which feeds into the op case because firstly, things like deforestation has been caused by the policies of the British Raj. But secondly, the need for rapid industrialization in India in an unequal form has been caused by the assumption of the resources of India by colonization, which in and of itself adds into the comparative which Nitin draws for you. The second thing that they never talk about is they never engage with Nitin's idea of double jeopardy. That is to say that if even if you were to buy Gov's best case that these governments are to be held liable to some degree, I think at that point of time they're already held liable through the ways in terms of how these governments are perceived, as Nitin explained. At that point of time, Gov needed to go ahead and explain to you why the threshold is additional and why this is not enough, something they never engage with. Understand that the government bench cannot tell you that consent of people is valuable while simultaneously letting an external actor undermine the consent by deciding what happens with the government of those people. At that point of time, then, the third thing that they fail to explain in the speech is in terms of how this deterrence manifests. Because understand, in countries where the governments don't believe in climate change at all, in countries where they don't want to help people out at all with regards to tornadoes and so on and so forth, the megalomaniac leaders over there, they're unlikely to think that they'll ever be ousted or out of office or they'll ever be prosecuted in the first place. So therefore, deterrence as a preemptive measure is something which never happens. So therefore, the large scale harm given by Nitin goes ahead and outweighs the matter which comes out of like DPM. Fourth, I think they go ahead and talk to you about some degree of investigation. I think internal investigations and so on and so forth are okay on our side of the house too. I think what doesn't happen on our side of the house is the greater threshold of a criminal liability with regards to crimes against humanities. The matter given in Nitin's speech with regards to that threshold is something again that DPM did not engage with. And last, I think they constantly operate on this assumption very fundamentally that these countries have resources to a certain degree, to a high degree, where they'll have technical expertise, this and that. I think Nitin's frame directly refutes this, and they give no additional analysis except assertion by telling you that hey, resources exist. Because what Nitin tells you that these are developing countries and so on and so forth. So on multiple fronts, they're unlikely to have those funds, and if they have those funds, they're unlikely to have the kind of management required to be able to allocate those funds. At that point of time, except assertion, like as long as OG does not prove to you or any government doesn't prove to you why as to why the intent itself then becomes intent itself is to cause harm, they can't take over Nitin's framing. But that being said, I'm gonna two things in my speech. First, I'm going to tell you why this policy is misdirected. Three things in my speech. First, why this policy is misdirected. Second, how double jeopardy manifests. And third, the larger harm which comes out of this. First, with regards to why it's misdirected, the first thing is regarding the idea of public perception. Note that this clashes directly with the idea of consent. Understand that when a large part of these developing countries are individuals from lower socioeconomic stratas. That is to say, then their incentives or expectations with regards to what they expect out of their government is with regards to like healthcare, education policies, and so on and so forth. At that point of time, then they are also unaware of the scientific specificities with regards to like climate change and so on and so forth. At that point of time, their consent is contingent on governments being able to go ahead and provide them certain things like education facilities and so on and so forth, which Nitin talks to you about. At that point of time, then the individuals from these the governments in these regions are likely to go ahead and prioritize other aspects of development instead of going ahead and having a preemptive disaster relief budget to that extent. At that point of time, then the metric that they give of consent is met on our side too. I think then but at that point, what OG still fails to like not engage with is the idea of like how these governments often don't have the kind of budget to have that kind of large disaster relief situation sorted out. Second, they don't oftentimes have the necessary know-how to understand how like predictions and so on and so forth work, considering there are oftentimes contrasting views in terms of when those predictions come. Then there's often an absence of environmental think tanks and so on and so forth, which would help guide the governments in the way possible. But at that point of time, then understand that governments are still making policies with regards to general benefit of people through health and so on and so forth. So I'm unsure as to where OG's case then stands. But even if we were to assume that case is true, I think the misdirection that is caused, that is to say that considering that government like the government, the harms identified by the government is caused by Western countries through like the changes in like seismic belts and so on and so forth through their different policies. At that point of time, even if we were to hold people liable, it wouldn't be these developing nations. At that point of time, what Nitin talks to you about is double jeopardy with regards to how natural justice ends up taking place, as if people go ahead and think that their countries have been horrifically managed, you're likely going to go ahead and question your next politician and so on and so forth. Then governments are likely to lose elections, and the people of these countries are already suffering at that point of time, and these policies again directly go ahead and impact the people of those countries in an even adverse way by causing instability through political ramifications, right? So at that point of time, like the governments are still being held liable. I think then the larger harm that we talk to you about is the misdirection in terms of how people perceive that it's the developing countries' faults rather than the Western nations' fault. Understand that this acts as a short-term fix, as oftentimes the West goes around parading saying that it is taking quick actions. What it then does is that it redirects the popular perception in Western nations into believing their governments are taking effective measures with regards to dealing with climate change and so on and so forth. The harm of this is that when the governments are able to satiate their masses, they're unlikely to go ahead and take action, which is likely to go ahead and actually deal climate change. The actions of Western nations is crucial to deal with situations like this, because first they have resources, and secondly the locus of blame with regards to causing these issues are also on them. So at that point of time, then the shift happens from looking at solutions from a global perspective, which would put the West under the scanner, to looking at the harms caused by the developing countries. At that point of time, even if we were to assume Gov's best case, even if you are holding these individuals liable, the large scale harm is your inability to go ahead and solve this environmental crisis or deal with this in an effective manner. At that point of time, for any government house to stand a chance against us, they have to draw the link for you as to why these developing countries should meet this threshold, and why the developed countries should have the ability to go ahead and shift accountability. Proud to oppose.
I thank the dealer for their speech. With that, we come to an end of the opening half. I request the member of government to take the stage and open the case for side CG. You should.
Hi, just wanted to check if I'm audible.
Perfectly audible.
Hello, excuse me. I'm really sorry, but before a member of government, can member of opposition like go to the bathroom real quick? I'm really sorry. This happened the last round as well.
No issue at all. Just give us a just type it in chat or tell us when you're back.
Thank you, thank you. I'm gonna make it quick.
Cool. I'll wait.
Hello, I'm back. Thank you.
Hi, okay. Few things. I won't be on this screen. I'll be on like another screen. So I'll be timing myself. Please don't spam in the chat for a POI. I'll voluntarily take one at 5. Yeah, and please don't unmute unless I ask you to. Cool. I will count you down. And oh, if I ever do cut off, please just text on the room 1 text channel on Discord. We're checking that on our phone, so we'll know that way. Just wanted to, yeah, give me like 10 seconds again, and then I'll start. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let's get opening up out of this debate, right? Firstly, 3 points of characterization which I can't believe are coming out in CG. Firstly, panel, understand that I'm going to contextualize this with an example. If a landslide happens in India because there was excessive rains or whatever, we're not going to try India, just because. What we're going to do in the spirit of this motion is that if India licenses a mining project on unstable land, which is very, very likely to cause a landslide, which then causes a landslide and causes immense physical and personal and economic harm, then we're going to try India, right? It's not just about we're going to try, we're not going to care about the global perspective behind this. We're going to talk about the fact that if you had information available and that was actionable information and you did not take a particular stance with it, if you did not inform your people, if you did not take the stances that you could have taken with the resources available to your government, then you're a wrong person, and you're a wrong government, and you're an evil government. Understand that this is not about just simply targeting one country just because they have natural disasters. It's about understanding that information is currently a monopoly of the government, and since individual mitigation is impossible for climate disasters, it is the responsibility of the government to actively engage and to actively cause a betterment of society in that case. Secondly, on double jeopardy, right? Understand that when you have a climate disaster in your country, you aren't held internationally liable, right? You just move on with it, right? You often brush it under the counter because you have other competing interests, or even in the worst case where you are rooted out, we don't think that you face any sort of backlash, right? We think that you just go back into your summer palace and just enjoy the rest of your life in peace, right? We think that there's no fear, and we think there's no accountability on governments to actively give a shit about climate change, to actively give a shit about stopping climate change on their end, right? And to actually give actionable information out to the people, right? Thirdly, harms to the political process. Man, what we're going to prove to you in the next 14 minutes of minor speech is we're going to actively delay the next climate disasters in these countries because of 3 key constructives, right? 1, resource sharing, right? Panel A, understand there is a point of time where you enforce this. More countries are likely to go out and talk to other countries and tell them that, hey, I want to prevent this next natural disaster in my country because I don't want to get hauled up to the ICC, i.e., can you give me these resources so I can, predict the best possible way I can deal with this tsunami, or the best possible way I can mitigate this flood. Understand this resource sharing is so critical in our case, because now you have developing countries who have an active incentive to go out and talk to developed countries and get stuff from them. Why do developed countries also have an incentive to give this out to them? Because they also don't want to haul countries out to the ICC and cause political instability, right? What they want to do is help. What we think that the entire world wants to help these countries, because these developed countries also don't want to get dragged into the middle of this. We think that then people will take active action to come out and actually develop R&D. We think they'll come out to actually have regulatory mechanisms. We think at that point of time the resource sharing becomes so much more. At that point in time, you have global political buy-in to delay the next climate disaster. Okay, panel, we'll agree that we can't probably stop all climate disasters, but we delay the next one significantly because now every country is taking active steps to go out and stop climate change, because now every country has an active governmental incentive, which is a personal incentive on the prime ministers of those countries to not be mean, to not be to not share information, to take the best possible outcome, best possible scenario that saves the most lives of the most number of people, right? Second point, we think that you often have competing interests which don't allow you to put forward climate sensitive policies. 2 points on this, right? We think you have economic or cultural competing interests, right? We think that, for example, in developed countries like India, you can't impose a lockdown because it's economically really harsh. But we think that at the point of time where you have countries who can go out and then say, look, boss, the world is telling us we need to do this, otherwise we'll get in trouble. The world is telling us that we need to lock down, that we need to stop these mining projects, we need to do all of this, otherwise we'll get in major trouble. At that point in time, you have active incentives to go out and put forward climate sensitive policies, right? We think that then you're able to get countries to actively give a fuck about climate change. We think that they actively care and actively put the people's best interest forward. But then third constructive on this, right? We think that corporates currently are able to do stuff because they don't have international liability, right? I.e., corporates can just come into India and say, bro, we'll just dump effluents in your country, and if you have anything to say about it, we'll just go to another country. Understand this stops now in our case. Why? Because now no country in the world is going to allow these corporates to do that, because wherever the corporate goes, every country is going to be like, no, boss, we can't allow you to do this because we'll get in trouble with the ICC. I.e., panel, corporates are now held individually liable, and they have to respond, they have to, be beholden towards those countries' laws. They have to follow, climate change policies, and therefore we do have governments that are not beholden to bad corporate interests which go against, climate change policies. Understand the net impact of all of this that we're presenting to you on our side, right? But now, fourth constructive, right? We think that countries are under immense pressure to do stuff in times of disaster, right? We think that opening up identify that correctly. We think that at that point of time, they're more likely to cooperate with ICC and try and give out information and try and get the best possible action done, right? Because now it impacts the individual personally, right? Understand that the thing about sanctions and the thing about stuff impacting the country as a whole often does not impact the political elite, right? At the point in time where you target the political elite and tell them that your negligence caused this thing, we're going to hold you personally accountable for this. At that point in time, they're more likely to give a fuck about that people. They're more likely to want to go out and cooperate with the ICC and information share. Secondly, we think the developing countries are immensely likely to have buy-in into this because they now rely on the ICC and they rely on these countries for all other economic stuff, right? I.e., they're going to engage, since they want to engage with these all other countries for economic gains, they're more likely to also engage with them on this parallel, because now this parallel of climate change being the responsibility of individual members in the government is now put as a burden on people. We think at that point in time, you have developing countries who have active buy-in into caring about climate change. We think that you reduce the ability of like developing countries to say, oh, it was just caused by the West. We think that you lose the ability of developed countries to say, oh, it happened in this country, because now you have global buy-in into caring about climate change. I'll repeat that point afterwards, but I'll first take a POI from CEO since they haven't been brought into this debate.
Okay. I just want to ask, because this was not even defined by opening, do you think that there's actually an example of a government not doing anything, not posting any warnings, like 0 warnings before a climate crisis? Or do you think there's some type of action already?
Good. Panel. Now look, I'm not going to give you specific examples about that because I don't have time in my speech. But what I can tell you is that governments, when they're asked to put like something forward, like should you have this like damming project in this river, which could cause a flood like 5 years later, but will cause you economic benefit. Most countries choose the economic benefit without caring about the climate change in it, right? We're not telling that that's necessarily a bad thing, right? But what this will incentivize countries to do is to actively care about the flood as well. Understand why that's so important. Now you don't discount the future possibility of a climate disaster that much. You care about it so much more, right? But now on last point, why there's so much buy-in. Understand that developed countries don't want like global economic crises. They don't want, like India does not want refugees from Bangladesh. I.e., they're more likely to care and they're more likely to help these countries actually get out of this mess, right? They're more likely to want to not have climate migrants, and they're more likely to give prospective attention to climate, right? We think that they're more likely to care to actually then develop R&D in those developing countries. We think at that point of time you have more buy-in from developed countries to actively stop climate movements as well. Secondly, we think that it stops the developing countries just putting competing interests ahead or even discounting the future possibility of climate disasters, right? At that point in time, we think that you have just such a net benefit on our side of the house where you delay, or best case scenario where you cancel the next human caused climate event, because now countries actually give a damn. They're actually told the direct consequences of that movement. We think that in SCO you don't have that. We think that what happens right now is just people allowing that to be washed away. We think that in our world you just have a much better society, and on that we're very proud to stand on CG.
I thank the member of government for that speech. I call upon the member of opposition to extend the case inside Operation Bench here.
You're here. Let's turn on my camera. All right. Am I still audible?
Perfectly.
Okay. For POIs through voice. I would love to say through video, but I don't look at my screen. So just through voice, say opening or closing. I'd like to take you for engagement. True voice, guys. Three, 2, 1, go. Lady Justice is blindfolded so that we know that she is impartial when it comes to making the decision. If I can prove to you that the standards that the ICC would do to prosecute these poor countries is actually unfair, we ought to win. But to extend the margin, we're going to also argue on the pragmatics of deterrence in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, some quick setup. Second, the assessment of opening half with also some engagement to closing government. And thirdly, into my extensions and unique analysis. 4 key pieces of framing that was kind of missed. Number 1, who defines what act accordingly means? I was listening to the motion clarification earlier. They said it was most likely going to be ICC and nobody quite defined it. So just retaking it from here. It's basically the ICC who would do these prosecutions. Number 2, what is a climate crisis and disaster effects? I think OG already said this in the answer to the POI. People would be mad, and if people are mad, they would be mad at the government. They're not going to be re-elected, and that's why it is most unlikely, moving on to my third framing, that the government's response is net zero. Look, the motion states defend that ahead of time but failed to act accordingly. It doesn't say that the government did nothing at all. When I asked closing opposition in the POI, closing government the POI, do these governments have like 0 warnings at all? They said, I'm not going to give examples, but you shouldn't believe that because there really are no examples. They can't build that whip. There's just simply no reasons because it is simply unreasonable for government to give 0 warnings at the end of the day. This is not a debate whether the government gives a warnings or not. This is a debate whether or not that standard is fulfilled by the ICC, and if the ICC sees that their standard is not being fulfilled, is it therefore justified that they caused them for crime against humanity? We think the answer is no. So there are warnings, and the people will be mad. By rationality alone, we can already see that we're just leveling the debate. Fourth, government's resources in far-flung areas is pretty not much that good, but we're just taking OG and CG. Like, even if they have resources, we're gonna still win. What are the goals and standards debate? Twofold. Number one, on the principle, is it right to call them out for a crime against humanity? And number two, on the pragmatics, are we sure that we're gonna have deterrence to make sure that these governments don't do it again? Responses first. OG said that it would drag eyeballs, and this is somehow of a similar argument that we get from CG with much more layers of analysis, to be fair. CG had like a chain reaction effect that said that, oh, when the ICC does this, you get more benefits, and therefore you get less incentive, and therefore you get deterrence to not like do it again. OG kind of has the same thing with like media attention. But at what point did they tell you how the ICC necessarily does this? Like, did they even give us one example on when the ICC had the teeth or had the guts to actually punish someone in a much more layered and grounded way? In their many years of existence, they have only passed less than 50 verdicts, and yet a lot of those verdicts still hasn't had concrete actions against that specific person. So we cannot just build government's frame for them and say, oh, it is punishing. Like, at what point did they explain that punishment is going to be big? Therefore, by that point alone, it significantly weakens them already in this debate. Second, OG argued legitimacy and responsibility, but here's a brilliant response. Legitimacy and responsibility of the state to intervene is not absolute. Meaning, let's say, for example, a parallel, even if the government has a responsibility to a criminal to not kill them because they are still a citizen of the state, in the instances they start shooting people and the government can't do anything about it anymore, they probably would shoot that person, and that legitimacy to intervene to save you ends there. It means that if I can prove in my arguments that the government cannot do anything anymore, not because they don't have resources, but because of the people itself don't want to evacuate and therefore has failed in the standards of the ICC, we already ought to take down the principal burden. Moving on to what are we going to do? Because OO talked about the lack of resources, the choice is not there in double jeopardy. But I think it is this good. We're going to do two things in this speech. So cycle number one, give you pragmatics as to why this is unlikely to change anything, which is significantly lacking for an opposition bench, because the government has been telling you a lot of good things and OO hasn't been telling you a pragmatic. We're going to do three pragmatics. But number two, we're going to give you the point of trial legitimacy. So not just on the fact that it was not their choice, we're going to go on a much deeper level. First, constructive. Why this would not bring a positive change on three key respects. What the first want you to know is that the tenet of justice that government has been relying upon is deterrence, that they would punish them so that they would not do it again, so that save lives. That is cool and a noble argument. But if we can flip this with the three layers of analysis, it would be much better on our side. Number one, stricter regulations would only lead to fewer evacuations. I would posit in a poor country, for a person living in the hillside in the Philippines, for example, when the volcanoes were erupting time and time again and there was imminent danger, there's a reason why hundreds of people still didn't want to evacuate. And that's because their livelihood would be damaged, because these people are dirt poor, and one day of evacuation means one day that they cannot serve their family. That's exactly the reason. In the instance that you do punish this country, they're more likely to implement faster evacuations, mandatory ones, which make the people angry even more, which are more likely gonna lead to them not cooperating with the government. Time and time again, in the developing country context, they simply do not want to leave for a lot of these cases. Number two, there's less support from the outside. In the instance that you then suddenly say that, oh, you're being tried for a crime against humanity, that is when you get less support from the outside to actually donate to you, which is my third point. There's now a perverse incentive for governments to keep the secret. They don't want this to come out of their traction record, so they would most likely rather lie about what happened at the disaster, that they've done everything that they could in accordance with the ICC standards, even if they didn't, which would lead to much more pernicious events, because now the government doesn't want to be prosecuted, because they don't want to lose aid, because they don't want the people to be angry. There's simply no choice for them, especially if the people are the ones that are not decidingly cooperate. In conclusion, we think that in terms of deterrence, if the only thing that we can hear from them is media deterrence and the punishment with the ICC, which you never even heard what the impacts are, we think that the three reasons I gave to you that are much more realistic and grounded in the true spirit of the poor world, we think we ought to win this debate already just by that argument alone. Before I extend the margin, is that opening? Go. Closing.
All right. Andrew, explain to me why governments won't build a safety net and won't try to take the absolute best possible measures for their people when they ask them to evacuate.
Yeah, Here's the thing, I'm going to explain that later in the compatibility argument, right? Because as I already told you earlier, they could have done everything that they could, but if it's the people that doesn't really want to leave, I'm not sure what you're doing. On the second layer of argument, on the principles, on 2 layers. Number 1, on incompatibility. Like, is the standards even fair in the first place? I'm going to draw a parallel. A Christian cannot judge a Muslim or a Hindu in their religious practice and vice versa because they don't know what it's like to be there. The reason why this is parallel to this debate is because the ICC doesn't know what the citizens of the Philippines, for example, want, doesn't know how much resources can the government actually do to force these mandatory evacuations. In the instance that you judge them by the fact that you weren't there, saying that they did a poor job when you don't even know what their situation was, is unjust in itself already. That's not impartial judging. But the second argument is that it's non-commensurate. In these trying crimes, what is looked for is twofold. Number 1, the effect of the action, and number 2, the degree of responsibility to the cause. I'm going to borrow that analysis from opening opposition when they said that it's usually big countries who pollute this. And it is exactly true. They're the ones causing landslides and floods. But we take it to a higher level because we tell you that is the main reason itself they cannot be tried. This is not commensurate. Otherwise, they should try other countries as well for the crime against humanity, the biggest accusation you can place to any sovereign nation. For all of those reasons, I don't know who's going second, but I do know who's going first.
I thank the member over here for their speech. I called upon the government to conclude the case with like government here.
Hi, can you confirm if I'm audible?
Strictly, yeah, perfectly audible.
Thank you. Just give me 10 seconds to get my notes together and I'll begin immediately. Yep. Okay. So I think that since Sanket took CO, I will be taking OO preferably and nothing from CO, given that you do have a speech beyond this to engage. I will voluntarily ask for a POI, at which point I don't, around 5:30. Nitin or Sneha, please feel free to unmute and interrupt my speech for clarifications. Great. So, right. So I will begin in about 3, 2, and 1. Panel, firstly, 3 very, very important points of clarification on what can be done by governments and what cannot be, in the sense that the field of this debate has been grossly misconstrued, right? 3 points then on that. Firstly, we're not saying that we're going to persecute governments for every instance of effluent dumping or coal pollution, because we can recognize that these are developmental needs for which alternatives are hard to come by for developing countries. We're saying that when governments recognize the critical impact that this pollution is going to bring in terms of a critical disaster, it is a bare minimum obligation for them to inform citizens and take accountability, something that is grossly missing in status quo. Secondly, on the field, we're the only side that tells you why this accountability of governments is exclusively necessary for environmental disasters and not for any other sorts of political or economic disasters as such. In that case, we can take this debate once we establish that other disasters have methods of post-harm mitigation and such machinery in place as food subsidies, employment guarantee acts, and so on. This debate is an entirely different ballgame because it destroys all the infrastructure from which governments usually rely on to alleviate a market crash and anything as such. For that very reason, and because the only solution to environment disaster control is prevention, we believe that governments are entirely liable. Thirdly, and finally on the field, it does not matter what hesitations governments might have in this debate and hold back information, because the moment we're able to prove to you that governments are the only power structures with access to such information, and if we recognize that they're obligated to make amends for climate change that has contributed to this disaster, we can win if we basically show you that the institution of the ICC is a recourse that can instill a sense of accountability until and unless opposition comes up with a counterfactual, right? Moving on to comparatives, right? Firstly, with OO. OO's entire case is literally this. Governments care about people. They do not hold back info on purpose. Even if it's a dictatorial regime, they will still want the best for their people. Note that CEO also asked basically the same POI to Sanket about why will governments withhold information. So we'll get two birds with one stone with this answer, right? We think this comes from a place of severe lack of understanding of the idea that governments are held hostage by corporates and capitalist structures that force them to allow continued pollution at the risk of losing foreign investment and employment, and risk making these corporates look bad, which in turn is detrimental to the economy that the government prioritizes so highly. So their idea, their singular idea in defense of the fact that governments don't deserve to be tried because they want the best for their people, falls apart for the simple reason that opposition is unable to prove to us why giving in to the qualms of these corporations is necessarily more important than the lives of the people. And this is a binary that they cannot refute. Secondly, on OO asks us two very important questions that become a deadlock in the opening half, which are, one important question actually, which is why does Bangladesh face tornadoes even when they do not pollute much? We think that there's a nuance behind this that they miss, right? We think that at a point in time where these governments are afraid of being tried by the ICC, they're likely to be far more wary of the impact brought about by the pollution that they allow in their country. To understand this nuance, it's also important to understand that disaster prediction technology is concentrated and pioneered in the hands of a few developed nations such as Japan and the US in the Pacific, right? This is important because it brings to light the fact that these countries, even while having knowledge of natural disasters, either did not inform the host country of a potential natural disaster, or that countries are not putting in enough effort to collaborate with these developed countries that do mitigate disaster damage by predicting it beforehand. We think that in our model, there is likely to be more information sharing, and that the entire world is recognizing that the largest polluters of the world, who are likely to have the best technology to detect these natural disasters, have a duty now to help smaller countries to avoid this disaster beforehand. This begs the question, why would these developed countries even help smaller countries? And the answer to this is simple, right? When the motion talks about governments that have information, this is not restricted only to the governments of the country where the disaster occurred, but also to the governments of those countries which have information about a disaster and fail to provide it. For example, if Japan withheld information of a tsunami about to hit Malaysia, right? Which also brings me to my second question. How will smaller countries with less budget even come up with disaster predicting technologies? And we think that this is a very, very important point and a good question that opposition asks. Our answer to that, right? It's important to understand what kind of countries actually have access to technology that can predict and prevent environmental disasters. It is common knowledge that these technologies such as satellites, seismographs, and so on are possessed in majority by powerful countries with a large sphere of influence and technology, which looks like the United States, Russia, and Germany. This means that since we're able to prove that in our case, one of two things happened, right? The first of which is that these countries come under the scanner simply because the effects of their pollution are easier to track by virtue of them being so large in volume. And secondly, these countries are forced to share information about natural disasters with other countries where they might be occurring because they know the far-reaching impact of their pollution, as a result of which the world will start to realize how they're bad actors for climate change, as a result of which they lose soft power. Please note that CEO's entire point about how the ICC does not try people enough is entirely irrelevant, because our paradigm does not rely on the fact of what the verdict of the ICC is, right? Because we believe that climate change is an issue that is cognizant of by the entire world, and it coming under the scanner is detrimental for countries irrespective of the verdict of the ICC. Before I move on to CEO, I will take a POI from opening up.
We gave 5 reasons why governments want and protect people from dying anyway, so either way they will work with other countries. And your only extension is that corporations and money. But Sneha preemptively weighed this. If a country wants foreign investment, they want jobs, they want economy, they want education, why is that bad? Who is ICC to tell them to take that off?
Right. So I think that's a good question. And I think the problem is that when you say that you want governments, essentially, if you think that governments are going to work for the betterment of people, also what you fail to realize is that the governments of developing nations and nations with lesser technology do not have the required resources their people in the first place, right? We think this is important because even if they're aware of natural disasters, by virtue of being developing countries, they're either likely to be held hostage by their economy, lack of and corporations, and B, if they're not aware of natural disasters, also on our side there is collaboration with developing countries and developed countries coming to the fore, which allows for this detection, right? Moving on to my comparative with CO, where we get one and only one constructive: deterrence and its lack thereof, right? CO says that this debate should be argued on the idea of deterrence, and they claim that the ICC has handed out less than 50 punishments historically and therefore is meek and will not punish people in the future. We feel that the moment an environmental disaster is included under the definition of crimes under humanity, there's going to be a vastly larger number of cases that the ICC deals with, irrespective of the verdict given. We think that even in our worst case that certain countries are let off the hook, climate change is an extremely widespread issue which is likely to transcend boundaries of soft power and actually bring attention to countries responsible for these natural disasters, as well as those that withheld information about them. We think most importantly that CO places a very unfair burden on us to prove that the ICC will punish people each and every time, especially because CO never proved to us why the lack of any arbitration at all is likely to make countries pollute lesser, why it's likely to make countries that actually pollute the most, that have the most technology, go out and help countries. And we feel that they do not explain why these countries are going to bring about measures that benefit their citizens and provide them with a safety net. Even if they wish to, they don't prove to us why it can be done without the help of other countries and more resources and international attention in the first place. Just to wrap up, what did we bring to you in this debate, right? We told you specifically why environmental disasters and not any other sort of economic or political crisis should be tried as crimes against humanity. We told you about corporates holding governments hostage. We told you about the inability of most nations to provide any sort of insurance or infrastructure or like any premiums or subsidies to people, because people have literally died in natural disasters. They've lost houses and they've lost assets. And something we exclusively brought to this debate was how climate change is viewed in the post-truth world and how impacts are the only way that it comes to the fore, and that trying governments is right and always will be. We're very, very proud to propose.
Perfect. Thank you, Gabriel, for that speech. I caught up on the opposition because on the case was like opposition.
Hello, am I audible? Hello?
Hi, you're perfectly audible. You're perfectly audible.
Okay. I'm just gonna drink a bit of water and then I'll start my speech.
Perfect.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. A few things to clean up this messy debate. First, opening government keeps arguing in the paradigm of climate change when it's difficult to actually link the climate crisis to specific disasters, especially when you're arguing an extremely high charge of crimes against humanity, which requires that governments perpetrate an active harm against their people with the intention of doing so. This is something that would be applicable to every country, given that it's being pushed by the International Criminal Court, whether or not they've actively contributed to this climate change. It's more likely that natural disasters, not climate change, would be tried because the link is much more obvious than the benefits of less pollution and the like are unlikely to happen. Second, closing government overstates the impact of the ICC. Like the states and politicians of every single country will immediately control their actions based on what they do when crimes against humanity still happen. When the president of Philippines himself is being investigated by them but still does not care. There has been no extra attention put on the issue of the drug war just because more people are watching now. There is no direct impact. As a whole, government is very weak and has a confusing case that often contradicts itself. Third, our opening does not address how even if these states do their best, the people themselves will be directly affected by these emergency measures. If governments do not take the appropriate action as judged by the ICC, then it's going to be because it interferes with other more immediate threats like economic loss to the people. Even if you say that sounds greedy and like they're just looking for money, think of it from the perspective of a poor person who will lose their whole livelihood when they move away from their normal areas just because of some prospective volcanic eruption or something. They're going to end up starving, and it's not like the state has the resources to feed them either, to the extent that the government bench would have you believe. The status of the national economy matters insofar as the people will be affected on a very human level, and it's very privileged of them to say that it won't. So for a few rebuttals against the closing government, first of all, they said that the reasons why governments withhold information is because they are being held by corporations not to do it. Firstly, I don't think that this response can be credited because it was said at WIP, wherein member did not give any analysis of why this is likely. This is responding by building. But secondly, we think that the disincentive due to angry people being mad at governments attacking them in elections is the more likely thing to happen, which is something OG conceded and therefore the much more believable frame already. The second rebuttal that I will make is that they said that verdict doesn't matter, that it is only about putting the environment in the microscope. This is therefore irrelevant given the multiple ways this can happen anyhow, especially if people's lives are at stake, which we explained in our arguments. Lastly, they just said we did not give a counterfactual on how we lessen climate change. However, this debate isn't about that anyway. This is a debate on response and responsibility. So on the best case of government versus the worst case of opposition, the best case of government is a world where attention is suddenly brought to the issues that are brought to the ICC, which they are investigating as crimes against humanity. However, since OG also states that this only happens with the biggest issues that already have a significant amount of evidence, we think that these are likely disasters that already have attention, meaning that their benefit is mitigated and not large at all. The worst case of opposition, therefore, is a world where states do not immediately have to be crucified for their actions. Yeah, governments might occasionally make the wrong call, but it's still just part of the cost-benefit analysis, which will always prioritize the people at the end of the day. Our world is thus better because we tell you why the benefits posed by government are not exclusive, but the harms they will bring are. Thus, there are two main issues in this debate. First, is it principally justified? And two, where are the citizens of these countries better off? Where do they benefit? So on the first issue of why is it principally justified, what did we tell you? We told you that the definition of act accordingly by these countries is going to be judged by the ICC, which our opening failed to do. The fact is that the ICC has their own biases as well, and the cases that would actually count as crimes against humanity would most likely not fall under this umbrella, and other cases that would actually not count would be prosecuted anyway. So what did the other team say about this issue? Opening governments said that governments have a duty and obligation to their people. Opposition agrees with this. This was never something that we argued against. But even if this is true, the first thing that we must note is that climate change is not their only concern. It is in fact probably the last concern that they have on their list, given that they have many other more immediate things to worry about. Even if government decides to do something in advance, many people are going to end up saying that the government is doing the wrong thing just because they're overreacting, because their lived experiences on that motive are going to get significantly worse. The people are not going to like what the government is doing either way, even if it is something in their own benefit. And the government has to weigh that in regards to the immediate effect to the people versus what may or may not happen in the long run. They also said that governments have the most resources. However, this is untrue because number one, we must know that not all countries have the same resources. And if we assume this, we are arguing an incredibly privileged framework. In fact, the rich countries would probably only be answerable to the ICC and actually need this intervention are the most unlikely to be called for the simple fact that there's all this political will that they have that other more developing countries do not. Okay, I'll take that, PY.
Your analysis on, oh, government doesn't care is exactly the problem we solve. Responsibility flows from the actor, which contributes to disaster. This came in my first speech. All your extension speech did was say, oh no, not ICC, that in a THBT motion, you still haven't engaged with the principle. Tell me and break the deadlock.
Okay, the reason why we say that we win on the duty and obligation to their people is that these governments are also caring about other things that are more immediate, that are not certain harms. The government has to accept a certain level of harm on some metric. They are not superhuman. They cannot save them completely. However, we think that that every cost-benefit analysis at some point is going to fail, but they are still doing the best job that they possibly can in trying to help the most people. Which brings us to our third point, in which the opening government seems to claim that these governments meant to do harm. However, this is unlikely because going back to the beginning, governments are also affected by these disasters. They do not have the intent and they're trying in other ways but have failed. Closing government then seems to argue on the metric of information, that information is limited to the states and they're not sharing it with anyone else. However, the age of information means that this is a harm that is mitigated. This information has already been collected by third parties and the like, and people are most likely be informed, such as in the case of the impending West Valley fault in the Philippines. They continue to say that it is the bare minimum for the government to inform people of these disasters. Again, we already tell you that the government is already doing this and that they are doing their best. So more importantly, why do we win in this issue? We win in this issue because we tell you that governments are still trying to fulfill the principle of duty and obligation, and how even if they try their best, it might not necessarily work out. You cannot judge from the inside. On the second issue of where are people better off, what did we tell you? The ICC will be unable to actually force these countries to do anything if they are found responsible for any crime against humanity, something they did not mechanize. So what did the other team say about this? Our opening said that natural justice would take place. While we agree with this, O never addresses how this happens other than the vague battle cries of the government. And they also next, for opening government, they also said that there will be more attention put on them. However, climate change is already an issue that people pay attention to. And this is illogical because it's not like the citizens immediately pay attention to the ICC. It's most likely to be the citizens of other countries who can't actually do anything to help. They also continue to say that not every case will go to the ICC, meaning that no resources will be affected. Even if this is true, evidence would thus be difficult to gather and there would be no incentive to fear the ICC because it is unlikely that they'll end up the few on the chopping block. So we win this issue because we told you why change is likely to be enacted, and we win this entire debate because all of the arguments we made still stand. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Excellent. I thank the opposition for their speech. With that, we come to the end of the debate. I request all the speakers to cross the room and thank each other.